In the public consciousness, Leonardo da Vinci is most commonly associated with two of the most celebrated paintings in the Western tradition, The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. These paintings are just two examples of the complexity and insight which shaped his work. Born in 1452, he was the consummate Renaissance man. Painter, sculptor, scientist, engineer and thinker, Leonardo's undoubted genius enabled him to evade the restrictions which a single discipline would impose. He was to achieve an almost legendary status in his own lifetime.
I think he was a genius. He began to see how things could be made and could be made differently. He began to see the elements of things. He also had this intense interest in the way things work. He had a huge curiosity.
Leonardo challenged all the prevailing scientific notions of his day, whether in anatomy, engineering, or architecture. He symbolized brilliantly the revival of true scientific inquiry.
There is a very clear sense that in terms of using the visual medium, that no one could begin to emulate the range of what he was doing.
Freed, linked to a restless nature and a need for experimentation, meant that much of his work never reached fruition.
There are various reasons why Leonardo didn't finish quite a lot of projects. Some are practical, his patrons fell from power and there are all these vagaries which happen to any Renaissance artists. But there is this serious problem that if in looking at one thing you can always see its implications for something else, if you're writing on water, and you can then see the implications of that for broader geological questions of the body of the earth, or you can see its implications for hair, or you can see its implications for music or sound, then you're in trouble, because you can't settle in a sense that no question is self-contained. It's a wonderful vision, but it's one which doesn't make for ready completion of a single project.
In 1501, he was commissioned to paint a fresco celebrating a Florentine victory in the war with Pisa. This wall painting of the Battle of Anghiari was never completed. However, Leonardo made many preparatory drawings. Among them was a full-size cartoon, which shows the horror of battle. Although the original cartoon was destroyed, there is a copy in existence, made by the artist Rubens. Perhaps the most memorable aspect of his work is his ability to capture the subtle emotions which reveal the innermost processes of the mind. Leonardo used light and shade to create three-dimensional bodies and added atmosphere and depth to his work with subtle color changes. The Last Supper reveals the psychological isolation of Judas. However, it is the mystery of the inner life captured by the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa which has generated more discussion than any other portrait in the history of art.
The smile gives, above all, a sense of the motions of the mind. Portraits with no expression at all, which was rather the norm, clearly didn't give a sense of a mind turning over in the brain and actually working. But it may also be a pun. She was married to Francesco del Giocondo, and her nickname was La Gioconda, and that means the happy or smiling one. So I think it's possible that the smile could be an emblem.
He did something very strange with the horizon. Perhaps I can demonstrate this with my hands. On one side of the picture, the horizon is here, and on the other side of her head, the horizon is up there. So the viewer is continually oscillating, particularly around the eyes, and that creates the ambiguity.
And the Mona Lisa out of its frame, particularly if the light changes slightly, kind of breathes against the background. It has this extraordinary quality of being alive. And I think the Mona Lisa probably comes as close as you could ever come to satisfying this total ambition that Leonardo has to get everything right in painting.
For Leonardo, painting was just one form of artistic expression. In pursuit of an unprecedented realism within art, he constantly sought to increase his knowledge of the physical world.
When Leonardo made a painting, any painting, he was aiming for it to do everything. To have the motions of the minds of the figures in the picture, as he called it, to have perfect veracity for every light effect, perfect veracity of space. And he set himself an impossible agenda, and he never quite realized the limitation of painting.
In common with his artistic methods, Leonardo's scientific theories were based on precise observations. He wanted to discover the underlying laws which governed nature. It is impossible to isolate Leonardo's art from his scientific studies. He believed that his art was science. Drawing became an extension of his creative thought processes. Detailed studies of plants, animals, and humans were part of an untiring quest to capture the absolute likeness of his subject. His sketch of a lily demonstrates not only artistic brilliance, but also the minute detail of scientific observation. One of the formative influences in Leonardo's life was his childhood in the Tuscan countryside. He was allowed to wander at will in a landscape whose changing moods heightened his awareness of the power of nature. It was here that Leonardo's enduring fascination with organic life began, as he mastered the art of observation.
With such persistence in solitude, he developed a remarkable artistic skill and a remarkable keenness of observation, which were in fact to underlie his anatomical illustrations in the future.
Until Leonardo, no one had studied the human body in such detail. It was considered sacrilegious to cut up human bodies. His use of dissection to uncover the body's innermost workings was to bring Leonardo into conflict with the Church. Leonardo's unique approach to anatomy produced a new method of scientific study, based on thorough observation. His notebooks are full of precise illustrations and supporting notes. He produced the first anatomical drawings, which were of such quality that they have formed the basis for modern scientific illustration.
As a medical historian, one would say that his important contributions to anatomy were the concept of sectional anatomy of the limbs, whereby anatomy was perceived in horizontal sections of the limbs. Leonardo also made astounding discoveries of the anatomy of the heart, and it is entirely conceivable that if his writings had not been lost, the discovery of the circulation of blood would not have had to wait for Harvey and would have occurred much earlier.
Leonardo was able to unify areas of study which had previously been seen as distinct. Through his studies of the human form, which encompassed both the external and the internal, Leonardo produced figures of remarkable realism. His drawing, The Proportions of the Human Figure, not only expresses the precision of his anatomical studies, it visually blends together mathematics and nature. Leonardo recognized that written explanations of complex issues could prove obscure. He knew that it was his drawings which would most effectively convey knowledge. Art became a method of communicating science. If the scientific and theoretical writings contained in Leonardo's notebooks had been made public, they would have revolutionized the science of the age. However, he did not choose to publish them.
I think there are two problems here. There's a practical one. Illustrated books were still very rare, and most of the illustrated books had woodcuts which didn't deliver enormous amounts of quality. Now, if you think about Leonardo's drawings, how detailed they are, how perfect they are in their spatial definition, then he would have needed copper plates. He would have needed very expensive engraving techniques, which are very difficult to print in book form. But the overriding problem is that none of the projects were wholly complete. He could always see the next step. He could always see something more to do. So there's this frustration of seeing this wonderful open-ended agenda, but how do you actually get a completed work out of that? And he never really solved that problem.
Yes, quite a lot of what he did would have revolutionized science and technology of that time, but he put it to good effect in as much as he published his work via those people who mattered most, namely those who employed him as the senior people of that society, dukes and so on.
In 1482, Leonardo left Florence to work for Lodovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. This association was to last for almost 20 years. In a letter to the Duke, Leonardo offered his services as a military engineer, demonstrating the extent of his technical achievements. In an age of war, this might have seemed an indispensable skill. However, Lodovico was more interested in Leonardo's expertise as an artist and sculptor. Handsome and gracious, Leonardo was popular at court and organized pageants and masquerades to entertain his patron. Despite his personable nature, Leonardo was, at heart, solitary. He did not allow court duties to deflect him from a single-minded pursuit of knowledge. While in Milan, Leonardo pursued his interest in mathematics. He collaborated with the mathematician Luca Pacioli and illustrated Pacioli's celebrated work On Divine Proportion.
If we're thinking about Leonardo mathematics, we have to differentiate between the sorts of mathematics. Arithmetic was of some interest to him, but he was pretty poor at it. He couldn't add up a column of many figures without making mistakes. He wasn't at all interested, as far as you know, in algebra, which was available in rudimentary form, and it's geometry. It is geometry which is visual mathematics. And he clearly saw geometry almost as a form of visual sculpture. He could take three-dimensional bodies and manipulate them geometrically. He could clearly see forms in space. So geometry became a kind of mental sculpture for him, and that is where his genius as a mathematician lies.
The notebooks and sketches from those years in Milan reveal Leonardo's mastery of an ever-widening variety of subjects, ranging from botany and geology to anatomy and architecture. His study of a Star of Bethlehem is a masterpiece. It conveys not only the sense of movement and vitality which Leonardo always tried to capture, but also a degree of detail which is almost microscopic. He understood the effects of sunlight and gravity on plant growth. He discovered that it was possible to determine the age of plants and trees by studying their structure. One of the driving forces in Leonardo's life was his intellectual curiosity. He wanted to understand every aspect of the universe. Far in advance of 19th century Darwinism, Leonardo's investigations into fossil shells enabled him to formulate evolutionary theories.
Leonardo was enormously interested in the Earth as a living body. He called it the body of the Earth, and he thought it had undergone enormous changes over time. Now, he saw that there were fossils on mountains, but for a variety of reasons didn't think a single deluge, the biblical deluge of 7 days and 7 nights, could get slow-moving creatures up that high. and they were clearly alive on the mountains as he saw them. So there are a whole series of arguments like that, and he came to the conclusion that there must have been multiple inundations, and the earth must have been submerged, and it's been subject as a kind of living body to huge changes over a period of time. Now, these ideas were not absolutely revolutionary, but had they been published, I think they would have caused something of a scandal.
Leonardo's power of observation, when linked to his soaring imagination, was an invaluable tool in the many and various roles he adopted. In his own time, Leonardo was well known as an architect and sculptor. His architectural drawings include designs for the dome of Milan Cathedral.
If we think about Leonardo as an architect, it's difficult in the period to define what an architect was. There wasn't a body of professionals who you could call architects, and different people intervened at different points. I think I would describe Leonardo as a brilliant architectural consultant, but probably not an architect who built buildings. And his great quality as an architect was he could see space in a particular way. It's the same way he treated geometry. It was a form of spatial sculpture. And I think nobody had, at that period, a clearer vision of a building as a way of sculpting space, of shaping space, and his drawings reflected that. And he had enormous impact upon Bramante, the man who built St. Peter's, or started St. Peter's. And that great, massive building, full of space and full of volume, is very much a product of the kind of vision he pioneered.
Although none of Leonardo's architectural plans were ever realized, the skill and imagination they reveal is remarkable. Leonardo's scheme for palaces and roads at various levels had a practical purpose. In an age of recurring plague, this drawing was his design for a new and healthier Milan. Leonardo envisaged a city of space and light intended to prevent the spread of disease. This model city was on 2 levels. The upper level was to be pedestrianized, while carts and carriages, which formed the traffic of the day, were restricted to the lower level. Leonardo's notebooks indicate that he fulfilled a series of minor commissions for Lodovico. However, one major commission was a memorial to Francesco Sforza, the father of Lodovico. The memorial, which was destined never to be completed, was to be a colossal equestrian statue, cast in bronze. In preparation, Leonardo created a full-scale clay model. Its power and beauty were widely acclaimed.
Leonardo's interest in animals was quite patchy in a way. He never followed what we would call zoology. That science didn't exist at the time. He was enormously interested in the horse. The horse was seen as a noble animal, and in fact he had 2 projects at least to do equestrian statues. So he investigated a lot of horse anatomy and horse proportions. He spent ages measuring the most beautiful horses to find out how the proportions worked, as a kind of music of anatomical proportion, which he did with human beings as well. He seems to have dissected a bear, certainly a bear's foot. He was very interested in animal movement. There wasn't a systematic campaign of zoology, and he wasn't interested in classification, essentially. So he had patches where he got suddenly involved with it, but it is the horse, and he is described as having done a book on horse anatomy, not a finished book, but a manuscript on that subject, now lost, but we've got some drawings to show what he did in that area. So he really was, I think, effectively in zoology, a specialist in animal motion, and a specialist above all in the horse.
Leonardo's interest went beyond the scientific. He had a love for all animals and birds. He bought caged birds in order to set them free. His own restless nature made him sympathetic to any creature deprived of liberty. Leonardo's first allegiance had always been to man and nature, as he sought for his goal of perfect truth. Despite his affection for his native Tuscany, no city or country could command that same allegiance. The resulting detachment from any sense of involvement in the politics, war, and intrigue of his age saw Leonardo enter a period in which he lived an almost nomadic existence. Venice, Florence, Rome, and Milan were all stages on this ultimately wearying journey, as Leonardo put his mental and imaginative powers at the disposal of various patrons. In 1502, he made the controversial decision to enter the service of the treacherous Cesare Borgia.
I think that possibly why he went to work for him was because Cesare Borgia appeared to be working in order to help the Pope against the pressers who were trying to come in and take over Italy at that time in that century. And Leonardo would naturally want to go and help in that. However, when he was working for Cesare Borgia, he discovered he wasn't a very nice person at all to work with. Indeed, it's rumoured that he actually raped one of the ladies who belonged to his former employer.
Cesare's enterprises began to fall apart. He was betrayed by some of his own captains. He became ill. So I think it was a short-lived episode, but Leonardo was always looking for a patron who would basically give him a kind of research contract, looking for a patron who would support his interests across the board. And Cesare, for a time, who's a very magnetic figure, seemed to promise that, but it fell apart.
In the service of Cesare, Leonardo was able to demonstrate his ingenuity. He made plans to drain marshes, designed canal systems, drew maps and designed fortifications. However, Leonardo was unable to maintain his intellectual detachment in the face of Cesare's murderous nature, and he left his service in 1503. Whichever patron he worked for, Leonardo was continually exploring and experimenting to further his own research on flight. He made countless sketches of birds and studied the anatomy of their wings. Leonardo trusted the logical conclusions of mathematics because they were based on concepts of universal truth. However, he knew that science must be based on experiment. Only in this way would knowledge increase. His experimental drawings show designs for flying machines.
Leonardo produced a large number of drawings of various devices like flying machines. I don't think there's any strong evidence that he ever tested them. Other people were testing things at the same time. There was a celebrated abbot in Scotland who decided that he was going to demonstrate the power of alchemy by doing a solo flight non-stop from Stirling to Paris. He got as far as the first 100 yards, and he fell down and broke a leg. And I suspect that had Leonardo tried any of his flying machines, he might well have landed up in the same situation.
When we think about Leonardo's flying machines, I think there are two phases that we have to look at. One is when he was thinking of flapping machines and essentially imitating a bat or a bird's wing. I'm pretty certain that he then concluded, as a result of tests or thinking about it, that there simply wasn't the power in man's frame to drive that huge machine. And the later ones come very close to what we would call hang gliders. He was thinking then of gliding systems with the wings and tail used for steering purposes.
The one that was most likely to fly, I think, wasn't actually one that he most liked. He rather liked the bird's idea of flapping wings and so on, but he got that wrong, I think. The one that really would have worked, I think, was the helicopter, because he had a mechanism, and that mechanism, once he could find a way of moving it other than human power, could possibly have worked.
His design evolved from flying machines to other devices intended to be used after flight had been achieved. One of his drawings is of the world's first parachute. It was to be many centuries before other inventors introduced similar life-saving devices. Leonardo was fascinated by the elements. He was obsessed with the power and movement of both air and water. His series of drawings, The Deluge, which are almost abstract in form, show a raging sky and torrents of swirling water. For Leonardo, the properties of air and water were similar. Just as clouds were supported by air, so water supported anything that floated on its surface. He saw flight as comparable to swimming. Leonardo brought his acute power of observation to bear on his studies of hydrodynamics. In the process of his research, he discovered the effect of the moon on tides.
Leonardo did interesting drawings of the flow of fluids. This was, I think, largely because he was very interested in anatomy and in biology and perhaps in the flow of blood through the body. He wasn't able to take this work very far. He was 200 years before anybody was really in a position to do very much in the way of hydrodynamics.
Just as Leonardo believed that man would fly, his drawings demonstrate a desire for man to master the sea. He experimented with buoyancy and invented ski-like shoes for walking on water. Leonardo's sketch of the first lifebelt anticipates exactly the design evident on ships today. There is evidence that Leonardo invented a system for supplying air to a man underwater. He is believed to have destroyed the details of this device because he recognized the potential for its abuse by the evil nature of men. Leonardo's study of hydrodynamics drew him further into the field of pure technology. Much of Leonardo's reputation for technical innovation rests on his work as an engineer and inventor. Leonardo lived in an uncertain, violent age. Renaissance Italy was constantly at war. Racked by internal disputes, she was also under threat from other states. During the Renaissance, it was usual for craftsmen and artists to be familiar with weaponry. Both Giotto and Michelangelo drew plans for the fortification of Florence. Practical science became important in relation to war as more effective ways of dealing death were sought.
It's often said there was a revolution of warfare in the late 15th century, especially with the introduction of new fast-firing light cannon that could accompany armies on the march. But the real role of artillery was to break into fortifications, and most of the warfare fought in northern Italy, the late 15th, early 16th century, what are usually known as the Italian Wars, centred around fortifications. And so what you needed as a dynast, as a ruler, was a master engineer who could both build you successful fortifications and also help you construct the siege weapons which to batter them down and defeat your opponents.
Leonardo's untiring search for knowledge was at the heart of both his artistic and scientific endeavours. In the years he spent working for Lodovico Sforza in Milan, Leonardo was constantly designing equipment intended to improve the performance of the military. He offered Lodovico a wide-ranging quantity of ideas. There were plans of bridges, pontoons and fortifications. Although he saw war as bestial madness, Leonardo produced numerous designs for weaponry. Some, like his detailed sketches of scaling ladders, were improvements on existing equipment. Leonardo's design was for a mechanized ladder which could be raised or lowered using a system of cranks and gears. This is similar to the equipment used by today's firefighters. Other designs were of his own inventions and included a triple-tier machine gun which produced a hail of shrapnel. There were also hand grenades and exploding mortars.
He made a lot of designs for all kinds of weaponry, helpful in sieges, cannon, and also fortification itself, which was a very important thing in the warfare of the late 15th, early 16th century. I think we have to say that most of his designs never really came to fruition, and so probably weren't used in Ludovico's wars in the ways that he hoped they had been.
On a larger scale, Leonardo designed a covered armoured car, which had breech-loading guns. It was intended to be powered by hand cranks. This was the forerunner of the modern tank. It was not until the 20th century and the First World War that tanks were introduced into battle.
I think you have to say that his tank was impractical. I mean, it's sad to say because it's a fantastic design. It's got cannon firing on all sides, and there's also a cutaway diagram showing how it was to be powered. But it wasn't really until the late 18th century when they had the steam-powered cars, or really properly until the late 19th century with the development of the internal combustion engine, that you could ever create anything like the modern 20th century tank. So it had to remain a fantasy for his own day.
Leonardo's exceptional intellect and soaring imagination produced a constant stream of inventions. Their unique nature placed many of them beyond the technical abilities of the age.
There's the paradox that a lot of the things he actually did are not recorded in drawings because they're on-the-site activity. And we shouldn't underrate the extent to which he did that. But the drawings, in a sense, are a kind of fantasy warfare which is deliberately aiming for style, for vision, to convince the patron, and when the patron's got the manuscript, for the patron to have something which is looks incredibly advanced, very stylish and incredibly wonderful.
I think Leonardo put a lot of his mechanical inventions to very good use, particularly in the area of the military applications, because he was employed for that particular purpose. And he certainly wouldn't have been kept in that employment if the things he invented didn't work.
Not all of Leonardo's designs for a time of war were offensive weapons, restricted only to a military purpose. Some, like Leonardo's design for a rotating bridge, may have originated as methods of fortification, but had a wider potential. This bridge, which could be swung across a river and back again, was a feat of engineering which demonstrated Leonardo's technical skill. One of his other bridge designs was for a two-level bridge. This adopted the same principle as Leonardo's plan for a model city. It used different levels to separate pedestrians and traffic. The type of framework which Leonardo designed for this bridge is identifiable in bridges built since the 19th century.
He clearly understood the way in which stress and materials could be used and assembled, because the structures that he created could easily be swung into position, so he could build the bridge very quickly on land. This was extremely important, something which was very uncommon at that time.
In 1514, Leonardo was in Rome. This was almost the last stage of his journeying. He spent 3 difficult years under the patronage of Pope Leo X. There was no natural affinity between the two men. Leonardo devoted his time principally to scientific experimentation.
As regards Leonardo learning or plagiarizing other people's techniques and ideas, there was a tradition of artist-engineers, in Italy especially, going back for 2 centuries, and he was particularly influenced by men such as Francesco di Giorgio Martini and Giuliano de Sangallo. I think it's fairer to see him as part of a tradition which he exploited, using his knowledge of both classical and modern, that is to say, in his own time, modern technologies and understandings.
Throughout his life, Leonardo had been interested in mechanical science. His familiarity with machinery had begun in Verrocchio's workshops. A fascination with machines of all types is evident in his analytical drawings of their component parts. Leonardo not only classified the different parts, but also specified their potential functions. His sketches show numerous reproductions of gear systems. Leonardo recognized that, if used appropriately, gears were a potential source of functional power. Gears, cogs and weights are central to many of Leonardo's inventions.
What characterizes his engineering drawings is a sense of how a complex system can work in 3 dimensions. And I think in his mind he could, in a sense, see the parts moving. And that's the quality of his engineering. So he brought his abilities to understand things in space, movement in space, which you see in all his drawings. He brought it to engineering.
The detailed plans Leonardo drew for all his inventions have allowed 20th century engineers to assess their potential. His ingenious design for a spring-driven car shows clearly that it would have been capable of limited forward movement.
I think many of his other inventions were probably more speculative. I think he enjoyed playing with ideas, and there were loads and loads of pictures of sketches of designs which were possibly never used. But it didn't stop him, because that's the way designers work. They will produce loads and loads of sketches of things, not expecting them to be used, because they're developing ideas and developing principles. But we don't quite know exactly how many of things might have been used, because we haven't got all that he produced. The evidence was that he was far more prolific than even the small amount that we've got indicates.
In pursuit of the precision he valued, Leonardo designed measuring devices. These included an odometer, an instrument to calculate distances. In order to measure time more effectively, he designed a clock with separate movements for minutes and hours. The clock was powered by gears and weight-driven mechanisms.
Many people were beginning to experiment with the idea of using a spring. Now, the difficulty with a spring is that when you wind it up, it will have its maximum force when it's fully wound. And as it unwinds, the force available goes down exactly in proportion to the amount of time it spends. So what Leonardo devised was a way in which, as the force went down from the spring, so he applied the lever principle or gearbox principle to multiply it back up again.
Leonardo believed that the key to accurate representation was acute observation. His conviction that vision was the most vital function led Leonardo deeply into the study of optics. He was familiar with the construction and function of lenses. His notes reveal the intensity of his study. Leonardo has been credited with the invention of the camera obscura. He understood that images were reversed on the human retina. There are indications in his notes that he experimented with simple photography. For a man of genius who was obsessed with the faithful reproduction of appearance, photography must have been a logical progression. One of the theories advanced to explain the mystery of the controversial Turin shroud involves Leonardo. It is claimed that he faked the shroud using a photographic image of a decapitated head. During his 3-year stay in Rome, Leonardo had used dissection in order to pursue his studies of the human form. He dissected bodies in the Roman hospital. This work was to end when he was accused of sacrilege.
Now, he had some German mirror makers working in his workshop who were making mirrors for him and doing various technological jobs, and these gave him a lot of trouble. They wouldn't learn German. They went off shooting with the Swiss guards and didn't do their work. In retaliation, it seems, the German mirror makers said to the Pope, Leonardo is dissecting illegally. We don't know the result of this, but there's no evidence that Leonardo got into trouble for the dissections he did.
In 1516, Leonardo entered the service of his last and best patron. The new ruler of France, King Francis I, invited Leonardo to make his home at the Château de Clou.
Francis offered him the biggest salary that was then available anywhere in Europe for an artist, an engineer, an architect for being in the court. And he also offered him accommodation in a manor house, a very gracious residence. So I think Leonardo went because of the opportunity.
The king made no demands on a man he saw as the intellectual and artistic giant of the age. He simply wanted the pleasure of Leonardo's conversation. The king gave Leonardo a home, a pension, and peace. Leonardo lived contentedly at Clou and died there in 1519. This most complex genius of the Renaissance belongs to the history of the human mind. Leonardo towered above his contemporaries. His true genius lay in the proficiency he achieved in a diverse range of highly specialized areas. He understood, more clearly than anyone of his century, the importance of precise observations. Leonardo's endless search for knowledge was both his triumph and his tragedy. He failed to complete artistic projects when other avenues of study opened up. His notes were never made public in his lifetime, and his discoveries lay hidden for centuries. Leonardo was a man ahead of his time. His unique, detailed approach to science and art was a mark of his true genius. The quality of his painting and drawing has endured throughout the centuries.
If you regard genius as the ability to innovate, to think on far wider parameters than any of your contemporaries, to essentially have a leap of the imagination beyond anyone around you, then yes, he was a genius.
It is truly remarkable that an essentially self-taught person, without any claim to a formal education, could have accomplished so much in so many disparate fields in a single lifetime.
No one had a broader feeling for the complete texture of the world and human beings as dynamic living systems, and could express that in visual form. I think the great genius lies in the drawings and the notebooks and in this vision. No one had a greater sense as to how the visual medium, drawing, could convey this vision of universal science, of universal knowledge.
When Leonardo died, his friend Francesco Melzi wrote, "The loss of such a man is mourned by all, because it is not in the power of nature to create another such."